At 5, my parents abandoned me at baggage claim. A stranger saved me, and only after he died did I learn he was a hidden tycoon who left me $5,500,000. My parents reappeared to sue me for it. In court, they smirked until the bailiff announced, "All rise for the honorable judge." I am Mark Hart, age 34. I sat at the defense table in my own courtroom, thumb tracing the familiar, thick red wool of the scarf tucked into my lap. I didn't wear it because I was cold. I wore it because it was the sole object connecting the boy I was to the man I had become. Across the aisle, Kevin and Karen, my biological parents, were laughing quietly with their attorney. They were already spending the money, $5,500,000. They believed they were about to steal. They hadn't even bothered to truly look at me, their movements sharp and synchronized, the way I remembered them from the airport. They didn't recognize me. They were expecting a victim, a soft touch, a man easily bullied by the lie they had orchestrated. They were expecting a stranger to hear the verdict. The bailiff's voice cut through the room's ambient hum. It was the moment I had anticipated for 3 weeks, ever since the process server had brought the lawsuit to my doorstep. I'll rise for the Honorable Judge Mark Hart. My parents stood, expecting a person they had never met. I stood with them. I walked past the bar, a boundary they hadn't legally crossed in 30 years, up the steps to the bench, and took my seat behind the imposing dark mahogany. The sudden, absolute silence that fell over the courtroom was not just respect for the law. It was the heavy, breathtaking silence of profound shock. Their lawyer's practiced smirk froze instantly. Kevin's mouth fell open, his eyes darting between my face and the nameplate resting on the desk. Karen's carefully crafted mask of aggrieved motherhood shattered, revealing a flicker of pure, unadulterated fear. I looked down at them from the high bench, my face impassive. I needed them to see me, to recognize the man they had created through their malice. The judge's robes were more than a uniform. Slept. They were armor built from decades of discipline, protecting the frightened boy who had once counted to 500. This was not a trial about custody or inheritance. This was a moral test, and I needed an outside perspective. I leaned slightly forward, resting my forms on the bench. "I need you to be the jury today," I said, my voice cold flat, and carrying the full weight of my judicial authority. "If your parents threw you away like oversized luggage to make a profit, would you let them back in for a second chance? Or would you destroy them?" I let the question hang in the air, allowing the silence. My silence now, which I controlled, to press down on them. Their lawsuit was an act of financial violence. I would respond with the law, but first, I would exact a personal cost. Before I tell you what they did, drop a guilty or innocent in the comments right now. I want to see where you stand. The story of my childhood began 30 years ago, in the loudest place on earth. The confrontation was over for now. The memory of their stunned faces, however, failed to satisfy the cold knot in my chest. To understand the depth of betrayal that had driven me onto the bench and them to the defense table, I had to return to the beginning. It was 1994, and O'Hare International Airport was the loudest place on earth. Terminal 3 hummed with a low, frequency vibration that resonated right through the soles of my sneakers. The chaos of motion was everywhere. People were rushing, their faces lit by the urgent glow of departures. Announcements were chiming, a chorus of voices and metallic bells. And the endless conveyor belts buzzed with a rhythmic, mechanical drone. I watched it all, feeling profoundly separate. I felt like a stone in a flowing river, stuck and heavy while everything else, the people, the luggage, the very air, flowed around me. I was 5 years old, wrapped in a red wolf scarf that scratched my neck. The wool was itchy and too long, dragging slightly on the dirty linoleum tile of the floor. I refused to take it off. I had convinced myself that it was the only thing standing between my small body and the biting, insistent draft of the automatic doors at the terminal entrance. It was my shield against the cold world. Kevin and Karen were walking ahead of me. They weren't holding my hand. They never held my hand. They were checking their watches, their movements sharp, efficient, and synchronized. They did not look like parents who were about to lose a child. They looked like people who were running late for a crucial business meeting. They looked annoyed. Karen glanced back, her eyes narrow and impatient. "Keep up, Mark. You're slowing us down." Her voice wasn't harsh, but it was clipped, carrying a tone of business-like frustration. I sped up, trying to match their long, confident strides. They led me past the ticket counters, where families were huddled in happy reunions, past the gates where people exchanged hugs, all the way down to the area marked oversized baggage claim. It was a strange, cavernous, industrial space, smelling faintly of jet fuel and stale coffee. This was where golf clubs, skis, and car seats were spat out onto a wide, metal carousel. The lighting here was dimmer, harsher, illuminating the concrete floor and the exposed pipes above. It felt like the guts of the airport, hidden away from the polished, passenger-facing areas. "Wait here," Kevin said. He didn't look at me. He was focused on a metal bench bolted to the cold floor next to the baggage track. "Watch the bags. We have to go get the tickets. Don't move until we come back." I stopped at the bench. The heavy red wolf scarf felt like a lifeline. "How long? How long?" My voice was small, swallowed instantly by the industrial hum. Karen was looking not at me, but toward the distant exit signs. "Just count the bags," she said, without turning. "Count 500 bags. By the time you finish, we will be here." I sat down, pulling the scratchy red wool up over my nose and mouth. I watched the first oversized item lumber out onto the carousel. I began counting, focusing entirely on the task, willing the numbers to move quickly. 1, 2, 3. A set of skis, a guitar case, a cardboard box taped shut. The carousel belt was loud, its internal mechanics buzzing and whining. I counted to 50. I counted to 100. Time seemed to stretch and warp in that industrial space. The crowd of passengers slowly began to thin out as they claimed their oddly shaped items. 200, 300. The buzz of the belt became rhythmic, hypnotic. I remember the smell of the jet fuel, the faint metallic tang in the air, the way my small legs swung beneath the bench. Every count was a step closer to their return. Every number was a promise. By the time I reached 500, the carousel had stopped moving entirely. The last golf bag had been claimed. The few remaining passengers had collected their things and walked away, disappearing up the ramp back toward the main terminal. The large, cavernous space became unnervingly quiet. The lights seemed to dim, humming with that low voltage, lonely sound that only silent, abandoned places make. I sat there, gripping the thick wool of my scarf. The silence was not peaceful. It was a vast, heavy void, an audible absence of sound that seemed to press down on my chest until I couldn't draw a full breath. I counted past 500, just in case. 501. 502. The mechanical drone of the belt was gone, replaced only by the distant, muffled sound of the airport's inner workings. My parents didn't return. And that was when I realized something that a 5-year-old Old shouldn't have the vocabulary, the experience, or the devastating clarity to understand. They weren't late. They weren't lost. They hadn't missed a flight and forgotten me. The look on their faces, when they walked away, hadn't been panic or regret. It had been relief. They had dropped me off at oversized baggage claim, because that is exactly what I was to them. Heavy. Burdensome. Something checked and never intended to be claimed. I was a liability they had chosen to liquidate. The heavy, suffocating silence broke something inside me. It didn't just hurt my feelings, it stole my voice. It commanded me. It told me I was nothing, confirming the calculation they had made. For 4 years after that night, I barely spoke. I was shuttled through the system, a quiet, watchful child. I let the world happen to me, because I was too afraid to make a sound. Convinced that if I did, the next person to hold me would abandon me, too. It took me 3 decades of intense, disciplined work to learn that silence was not just a wound, but that it could be weaponized. I learned that when I sit on the judge's bench and the courtroom goes quiet, waiting for my ruling, I control that silence. I use it to command respect, to enforce the law. But back then, in Terminal 3, the silence commanded me. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in my realization, gripping the scarf until my small knuckles were white. The silence was broken not by a returning parent, but by the distant whir of a vehicle. Eventually, slept. A security guard on a Segway rolled past the mouth of the bay. He did a sharp double, take at the sight of a lone child on the bench, and circled back toward me. He was reaching for the radio on his shoulder. But before he could say anything, a man stepped out from the shadows of a large concrete pillar. He had been standing there for a while. I realized later. Watching. Waiting to see if anyone would ever come back for the child on the bench. He was tall, dressed in a simple gray suit, and wore kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like what he claimed to be, an accountant. "She's with me," the guard said, pointing at me and raising the radio to his lips. "I'm calling social services. Been here too long." "No, no," the man said. His voice was soft, but it cut through the air like steel, arresting the guard's action. He walked over and knelt down in front of the bench, ignoring the grime on the floor. He didn't rush. He didn't touch me. He just looked at me, right in the eyes, acknowledging my existence in a way Kevin and Karen never had. "My name is William," he said. "I saw them leave. I'm sorry." He didn't lie. He didn't tell me they were coming back, and were just delayed by traffic. He told me the truth about what he had seen. And in that simple, terrible moment of honesty, he saved me from the lie I had been trying desperately to tell myself. William stayed with me. He stayed until the police arrived and logged the report. He stayed through the slow, agonizing process of foster care placement. And eventually, he stayed for good. He became the safety net that caught me when my own blood let me drop. He didn't try to force me to talk. He just sat with the silence until I eventually felt safe enough to give him fragments of my voice. He taught me that I wasn't heavy, burdensome, or something to be checked and never claimed. I was the person he chose to keep. He was my anchor, the one person who proved I mattered. For years, I believed that the memory of that day, the cold metal, the smell of jet fuel, and the crushing silence, would be the worst thing my parents had done. I believed their crime was abandonment. I was wrong. Their crime was accounting. Slept. And it would take 30 years for me to uncover the hidden ledger they had kept, and for them to realize that the liability they abandoned had grown up to become a judge who specialized in final rulings. The real cost of my life was still waiting to be paid. The truth of my abandonment was a deep, frozen wound that William's unwavering love had eventually contained. He taught me how to live again, how to use my voice, but he could not stay forever to hold back the tide of the past. William died on a Tuesday morning, quietly, the same way he had lived. There was no fanfare, no headlines, just a small service attended by staff from the local shelter he had secretly funded for decades. I sat in the front row, wearing the familiar red scarf, feeling the unnerving, heavy weight of the silence return. He had been my anchor, the one person who proved I was not just luggage to be left behind, and now the world felt unmoored again. Then came the reading of the will. I expected the deed to his modest house, perhaps a simple savings account. William always drove a 10-year-old car and wore the same quiet gray suits. Instead, his attorney handed me a portfolio thick with documents. William wasn't just a retired accountant. In the early 90s, he had quietly backed 3 of the biggest new companies in the Midwest, investing his simple savings and sharp mind into their potential. He had lived simply so he could give generously. The final number was astounding: $5,500,000. $100,000 for every year of his 55-year career. He left it all to me. The news broke 2 days later. Local judge inherits secret fortune. Local judge inherits secret fortune. The headlines screamed. I had built my life on control, discipline, and obscurity, and now, my worth was public, shining a harsh light into every dark corner of my past. It took exactly 48 hours for the phone to ring. It wasn't a call asking how I was, or a letter seeking reconciliation. It was a process server at my home address, delivering a thick stack of papers. A lawsuit. The plaintiffs were Kevin and Karen Hart. The suit claimed fraudulent custody and estate theft. They asserted that William had kidnapped me from the airport 30 years ago, and they had been searching tirelessly ever since. Victims of the sophisticated abduction plot. They demanded the full $5,500,000 as restitution for their pain and suffering, plus the deed to William's house. I sat in my living room and read the complaint. It was a masterpiece of narcissistic fiction. They described their agony at losing their beloved daughter, the hole in their hearts that never healed. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I adopted a judge's perspective. I looked at the lawsuit not as a wounded son, but as a judge reviewing a fraudulent case file. And that is when I saw the true nature of their accounting. To normal parents, a child is a person. To Kevin and Karen, I was an asset. When I was 5, I was a liability, a mouth to feed, a burden to carry through an airport, so they liquidated me at baggage claim to cut their losses. But now, 30 years later, my value had changed. I was no longer a liability. I was a receivable, one worth $5,500,000. Slept. They weren't back because they missed me. They were back because their investment had finally matured, and they wanted to cash out. It wasn't love. It was accounting. They thought they were suing a victim. They didn't realize they were suing the law itself. I put the papers down. I didn't call a lawyer immediately. Instead, I picked up my phone and dialed the number for the most ruthless forensic accountant in the state. I didn't want defense. I wanted war. I need you to dig, I told her. Go back to 1994. Find everything. I didn't answer the lawsuit. I didn't call Kevin or Karen to scream or beg, or ask why, which is what a son would do. I wasn't their son anymore. I was a plaintiff building a case against 2 defendants who had made a fatal calculation error. My arena was the law, and in my line of work, We don't operate on feelings. We operate entirely on evidence. The call went to Sarah Jenkins, the most ruthless forensic accountant in Chicago. She was known for a cold, almost predatory focus on financial irregularities, viewing every dollar as a lead and every tax return as a confession. I gave her one simple, searing instruction. Go back to 1994. Find out where they got their money, because grifters don't change. If they were greedy enough to sue me now, they were greedy enough to have tried to profit off me then. You don't just walk away from a child and not try to capitalize on the loss. For 3 days, my dining room table turned into a war room. It was not a place of dining or warmth, but of strategy and cold, hard facts. Sarah and I sat across from mountains of documents, digitized tax returns, old property records, and court archives that smelled like dust and rot. Sarah worked with a focused silence that mirrored my own judicial discipline. Most people think the past is buried under time and forgetfulness. It isn't. It's just waiting patiently on microfiche, indexed and filed, ready to be discovered. I watched her work, my own focus absolute. The emotional conflict was locked away. I was hunting, and my quarry was the truth. The accounting behind the abandonment. I had to know the value they had assigned to my life back then. On Tuesday night, around midnight, Sarah found the anomaly. She was hunched over a stack of digitized court filings from Cook County. She had gone through years of small claims and property disputes, looking for anything that suggested an influx of money outside of their documented income. "Mark," she said, her voice flat, cutting through the silence of the room. "Look at 1995. I leaned over her shoulder. The computer screen displayed a civil suit docket number. The parties listed were familiar, chillingly so. Kevin and Karen Hart versus American Continental Airlines. My body went cold, but my hands remained steady. They hadn't just walked away. They had sued the airline. I pulled the full case file. My hands, trained to handle delicate court exhibits and sworn testimony, did not shake as I turned the digitized pages. I felt like I was reviewing the blueprints for my own erasure. The complaint was a work of art and cynical fiction. They claimed that, on November 6, 1994, they had entrusted their beloved son to an airline agent at the gate for an unaccompanied minor flight to visit a sick relative. They claimed the airline had been negligent, that I had been allowed to wander off and vanish because the staff wasn't watching. It was a total, calculated lie. There had been no ticket. There had been no sick relative. They had walked me to the oversized baggage claim and left me there like freight. But in 1995, before ubiquitous cell phone cameras and digital tracking, they could spin a story. Who would question the grief of two broken parents? They claimed severe emotional distress and emotional damages. They described themselves as parents whose hearts were broken, whose child had been swallowed by the system. It was a compelling narrative of victimization. And then I saw it, the settlement agreement. The airline was desperate to avoid the bad press and the public scandal of a missing child on its watch. To prevent potential liability due to their alleged negligence, they settled out of court quickly and quietly. The check was for $450,000. In 1995, that was a fortune. It was enough to buy a house, 2 cars, and a lifetime of silence. $450,000. That was the price they had assigned to my life. I sat back in my chair, the metal edge digging into my back. The shock of the price tag was almost physical. They had sold me. They had put a clear, legible value on my existence and cashed it in. But the check wasn't the smoking gun. It was the dollar amount, yes, but the real legal ammunition was attached to the settlement. To receive that money, Kevin and Karen had been required to sign a sworn legal statement. An affidavit. It was a standard procedure for large civil settlements relating to loss of life or severe injury, often used by corporations to absolve themselves of future liability. I read the words again. For the first time in 30 years, I felt the air leave the room, replaced by a surge of pure, cold rage. The words confirmed the absolute malignancy of their abandonment. We, the parents, acknowledge that the minor child, Mark Hart, is presumed deceased. We accept this settlement as full and final compensation for the wrongful death and loss of our child, and we absolve the airline of all future liability. They had signed it. Kevin's signature, jagged and hurried. Karen's loopy and neatly penned. They had legally declared me dead. They had looked at a piece of paper that stated I no longer existed, and they had signed it in exchange for a check worth $450,000. They didn't lose me. They liquidated me. The anger that had been simmering in my gut didn't boil over. It did something far more useful. It crystallized. It turned into something hard, sharp, and perfectly clear, like a diamond or a gavel. They had sold my life for a fortune, spent it all, and now they were back to sell me again for $5,500,000. They thought I was a ghost, a victim they could haunt. They didn't realize that ghosts could fight back, especially when they had the full force of the Chicago bar and a forensic accountant on retainer. I picked up the phone and called my lawyer, the one I had ignored until now. I have it, I said, my voice steady, cold, and final. Don't settle. We're gonna trial. I looked down at the digitized signatures one last time. They had signed my death warrant. Now, I was gonna sign theirs. The war had just become personal, and I was holding the evidence they had forgotten to bury. The next act would play out in court. The affidavit was the receipt for my life, the physical proof of my parents' calculation. It eliminated the need for argument. Reducing their current lawsuit to the felony, it truly was a calculated, second attempt at fraud. The frightened child inside me, the one who had counted bags until the noise of the airport felt louder than his own voice, was finally silenced. The only thing left was the cold, professional clarity of the judge. I spent the next 2 weeks working with my legal team, not to defend against the absurd kidnapping claim, but to choreograph the moment of maximum legal and personal destruction. The focus was simple. The parents were claiming they were victims of a predator who stole their living son. The evidence proved they were perpetrators who had already collected payment for their son's death. The two narratives could not possibly exist in the same courtroom. The discovery phase was a formality. We produced documentation to show that William had legally adopted me, and that the inheritance was legitimate. Their attorney, confident in his client's performance of grief, seemed unfazed. He was betting on sentimentality, hoping a jury would sympathize with the image of heartbroken parents finding their long-lost son, only to be shut out by a wealthy judge. He had no idea what we were preparing to unleash. I kept the affidavit hidden. It was the absolute, unassailable core of our strategy, and its existence remained a secret shared only between me, Sarah Jenkins, and my lead counsel. It was the weapon, and we would ensure it struck with precision. I looked at the signatures on the digitized copy, Kevin's jagged, panicked scrawl, Karen's neat, loopy penmanship. They had signed a paper declaring that I did not exist, signing my death warrant. Now, I would sign theirs. The knowledge that they had priced me at $450,000 in 1995 brought a strange sense of liberation. It meant they never loved me, not even enough to fake a search for 3 decades. It was purely transactional, and transactions are governed by the law of contract and fraud. My initial anguish gave way to the crystalline anger that only a judge can truly feel. The cold, impersonal fury at a blatant betrayal of justice. I recalled my final conversation with Sarah Jenkins after she had located the document. "This is grand larceny, Mark," she had said, her voice unusually tight. "This is grand larceny, Mark," she had said, her voice unusually tight. They defrauded the airline and the courts. This is a felony, plain and simple. And now they've committed perjury just by filing this new suit. "We'll let the prosecutor handle the grand larceny," I responded. "Our job is to ensure they don't walk out of that courtroom with a penny of Williams' money. They want to be accountants. We'll balance their books for them." My plan was to achieve total victory. Dismiss the current suit, refer them for criminal fraud, and publicly expose them in a way that would destroy their carefully cultivated reputation as victims. The day of the trial finally arrived, drawing national attention due to the high profile of the litigants. A sitting judge and the parents claiming he was kidnapped. The air in the courtroom, already tense with expectation, felt electric. I looked down at Kevin and Karen, who had entered the courtroom wearing muted colors, their expressions set in masks of practiced grief. Karen wiped a tear she hadn't shed. They were selling the narrative, performing the anguish of the tragic loss. They believed their performance was flawless, honed over 3 decades of exploiting my absence for sympathy and charity. They still believed they were the victims, and I was the obstacle. But the frightened child who had counted to 500 was gone. In his place was the man who had looked at the cold, hard evidence and chosen his path. Slept. I was the plaintiff building a case against 2 defendants who had made a fatal error in calculating their risk. They had signed away their right to claim me, not just emotionally, but legally. A ghost cannot inherit. But the law states that a ghost cannot be sued either. And a ghost certainly has no living parents with standing to claim an estate. The moment they signed that affidavit, they nullified any legal claim they had to my person or my future. Slept. They had effectively signed away the $5.5 million 30 years ago for a fraction of the cost. My resolve hardened, becoming fixed and unwavering, like the sentence I would eventually deliver. The only path forward was total, absolute destruction. I wouldn't settle. I wouldn't compromise. I would use the full force of the law, the one thing they had never respected, to finally pay them, the only currency they understood. Consequences. The stage was set. The defendants were ready to perform their final act. They were about to learn that the one person they had declared dead was the only one with the power to truly kill their lies. The theater was beginning. I just needed to wait for the crucial moment to bring in my first devastating witness. The trial was theater, and Kevin and Karen Hart were the headliners. They took the stand one after the other, wearing muted, respectable colors. Their lawyer, a man whose ambition was clearly larger than his ethics, had coached them well. Their expressions were flawless, practiced masks of profound, chronic grief. Karen wept on cue. She talked about the hole in her heart that never healed, the phantom limb of her lost son. She described the agony of the unknown, the 30 years of wondering where I was. She painted a compelling portrait of 2 devoted parents who had been victimized by a wealthy predator. William, who had stolen their baby in a busy terminal. She spoke of the empty chair at the dinner table, the birthday cakes that were never cut. It was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. If I hadn't lived the terrible, silent truth, I might have believed them. I watched from the defense table, my face impassive, my mind operating with judicial coldness. They didn't look like the monsters who had left a 5-year-old to count to 500 alone. They looked like victims. They looked like parents who had spent 3 decades setting a place for a ghost. I didn't object. I didn't interrupt. I let them build their monument to grief, brick by lying brick. The higher they built it, the harder the eventual collapse would be. My attorney, sensing my resolve, remained calm, asking only minimal questions on cross-examination to preserve our credibility. We allowed their narrative to peak, to achieve maximum height, so the fall would be swift and total. When the defense's turn finally came, we didn't call character witnesses. We didn't call forensic experts to explain the absurdity of the kidnapping claim. We called only one name. The defense calls Megan Hart. The air left the room. It was not the suffocating silence of abandonment, but the shocking silence of unexpected consequence. Kevin's head snapped toward the gallery doors with genuine, unpracticed alarm. Karen let out a small, strangled gasp, clutching her husband's arm. They hadn't seen this coming. They thought Megan, the daughter they kept, the daughter they raised, was loyal to the family performance. They thought she was part of the con. They thought she was theirs. Megan walked down the aisle. She was 28, slept, a social worker with eyes that looked tired beyond her years, and a posture that always seemed to apologize for taking up space. She didn't look at our parents. She looked straight at me. It was like looking into a mirror that had aged differently. We had the same nose, the same jawline, the same set to the shoulders. But where the abandonment had forced me to grow hard, she had grown heavy, burdened by the weight of their lies. I had always assumed Megan was the lucky one. She was the one who got to go home. She was the one who got the parents. But as she walked to the stand, I realized I had it wrong. I had escaped. She had been trapped, forced to participate in the charade for 23 years. She took the stand, swore the oath, and sat down. She avoided Kevin and Karen's stares. And then, quietly, clearly, she began to dismantle their lives. Megan, my attorney asked, his voice low and sympathetic. What was it like growing up in the Hart household? Megan took a breath that shook her entire frame. It was like living in a mausoleum, she said. Her voice was quiet but steady, carrying easily across the hushed courtroom. I wasn't just their daughter. I was the replacement. She looked at the jury. I grew up in the shadow of the tragic lost brother. But it wasn't about missing Mark. It was about using his absence. This was the ghost sibling paradox. She explained how my absence was monetized. They used the story, Megan continued. Every time rent was late. Every time Dad lost money gambling, they would bring up the tragedy. The church gave them money. The neighbors brought casseroles for years. My brother wasn't a person to them. His absence was currency. Karen surged halfway out of her chair, her face contorted, completely dropping the mask. Megan, stop this! Don't you dare! Sit down, the bailiff barked, moving quickly. Megan didn't flinch. She reached into the tote bag she had placed beside the stand and pulled out a battered, dusty shoebox. It smelled faintly of mildew and old attic insulation, the smell of forgotten things. They told everyone they spent every dime searching for him. Megan said, holding the box up. They told me they hired investigators. They told me they scoured the earth. But when I was cleaning out the attic last week, looking for old photos of Mark, I found this. She opened the box. It wasn't full of missing person flyers. It wasn't full of correspondence with the police. It was full of faded, brittle thermal paper. "These are casino receipts," Megan said. "From the Empress Riverboat Casino in Joliet. These are dated November 7th, 8th, and 9th, 1994. The week Mark disappeared." She paused, letting the silence build. Kevin was sinking, slowly collapsing into his chair. A man whose entire existence was being exposed as a hollow fraud. While the police were looking for him at the airport, Megan whispered, her voice cracking. Kevin and Karen were gambling. They weren't searching. They were celebrating. The silence in the courtroom returned, heavy and absolute. It was the same heavy, suffocating silence I remembered from the baggage claim. But this time, it wasn't crushing me. It was crushing them. Collapsing the narrative they had relied on for 30 years. They hadn't just abandoned one son. They had devoured the life of the daughter who was left behind, forced to maintain the lie. Megan looked at our parents, tears finally spilling over her eyes. Not practiced tears, but genuine sorrow. "I used to feel guilty that I was the one who got to stay," she whispered. "But now I realize Mark was the one who got away. I was the one who was left behind to pay the emotional bill." Kevin sat motionless, gray-faced. Karen was weeping hysterically, not from grief, but from terror. My attorney didn't give the room time to breathe. Megan's testimony had cracked the foundation, but we needed to bring the whole house down. He walked swiftly to the bench and placed a single, yellowed, certified document in front of the presiding judge. A document pulled from the Cook County archives. It was the one piece of evidence that could not be debated, twisted, or lied about. "Your Honor," my lawyer said, his voice ringing with quiet authority, cutting through the stunned whispers of the gallery. "The plaintiffs are suing for custody of an estate based on their parental rights. However, according to this sworn affidavit signed on December 12, 1995, Kevin and Karen Hart legally declared their son, Mark Hart, deceased." Megan's raw, agonizing truth had created a vacuum in the courtroom, a silence far more devastating than any physical noise. My lawyer did not waste the moment, pushing the final, unassailable piece of evidence across the judge's bench. The courtroom hung suspended, waiting for the presiding judge's reaction to the affidavit. The presiding judge, a highly respected woman with 30 years on the bench, picked up the certified copy of the 1995 settlement document. Her eyes narrowed as she read the legal language and, crucially, examined the signatures of the plaintiffs before her. Her expression, which had remained strictly neutral throughout the highly dramatic proceedings, now shifted. It wasn't judicial neutrality anymore. It was pure, undisguised disgust. Kevin's face went the color of ash. Karen grabbed his arm, her fingernails digging deep into the cheap suit jacket he wore for the performance. They knew exactly what that paper was. It was the receipt for my life, the proof that the narrative they had just spent 30 years building, and the narrative they had just sworn to in court, was a carefully constructed, multi-million-dollar fraud. The judge laid the document down, tapping it once with a perfectly manicured finger. She looked directly at Kevin and Karen Hart. Her voice was dangerously low, a register I recognized instantly as the one judges use just before delivering a sentence that will irrevocably change a life. "Mr. and Mrs. Hart," the judge said, "you accepted $450,000 from American Continental Airlines for the wrongful death of your child, Mark Hart. You signed a sworn statement, under penalty of perjury, claiming he was gone forever and legally presumed deceased. She paused, allowing the weight of the facts to settle on them. Their lawyer, realizing he had been led into a carefully concealed minefield, physically stepped away from his clients. He began hastily packing his briefcase, desperate to disassociate himself from the inevitable explosion. So, one of two things is true, right now. The judge continued, her voice gaining strength, cutting through the stunned whispers of the gallery. Either you committed grand larceny and fraud in 1995 by stealing that settlement money while your son was alive, or you are committing perjury and fraud upon the court today by claiming a parental relationship and standing to inherit. Which is it, Mr. and Mrs. Hart? If they admitted I was alive back then, they were felons who had stolen nearly $500,000. If they stuck to their story that I was dead, they had no standing to sue me now, because a ghost does not have heirs, and certainly does not have parents with parental rights to a ghost's inheritance. Their entire case had imploded into a simple, inescapable choice between two felonies. I stood up. I didn't wait for permission. I didn't wait for my lawyer to speak. This moment was mine, 30 years overdue. Slept, and it would not be delivered from the impersonal distance of the defense table. I walked around the table, the red wool of the scarf brushing my jacket, and stood in the center of the aisle, facing them directly. For 3 decades, I had been afraid of these people, letting their memory haunt every quiet room I entered. But looking at them now, shivering, trapped, and small, I realized I wasn't looking at monsters. I was looking at parasites, pathetic and exposed. I used the voice I reserved for sentencing a violent offender, cold, flat, and final, stripped entirely of emotion. You sold me, I said. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. You didn't just leave me at the airport, you cashed me in. You put a $450,000 price tag on your own son, and you spent it on blackjack and slot machines. Karen tried to perform her final act. She opened her mouth, tears streaming down her face. The same familiar performance she had used on the church, the neighbors, and Megan for years. Mark, please, she choked out. We were young. We were scared. We loved you. You declared me dead. I interrupted, cutting through the lie with the cold steel of the legal fact. I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to an almost inaudible register, forcing them to strain to hear the judgment. You signed a paper saying I didn't exist anymore so you could buy a boat. Congratulations. You were right. I held their eyes, allowing no flicker of fear or pity to cross my face. The son you had is dead. He died in Terminal 3. The legal person known as Mark Hart was liquidated in 1995. I leaned in closer still, letting the silence stretch, forcing them to breathe the suffocating air of their own failure. This was the gavel of silence, and I was no longer drowning in it. I was wielding it, commanding it to crush their lies. A ghost cannot inherit, Kevin, I finished. But a ghost can haunt you. And I process left, and it will haunt you with every legal instrument at my disposal until you wish you had never walked back into my life. The presiding judge banged her gavel. It sounded like a gunshot in the stunned room. Case dismissed with prejudice, she announced. Her voice was firm, carrying no hint of mercy. Bailiff, please escort the plaintiffs into custody. I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for immediate investigation into insurance fraud and perjury. This court finds that the plaintiffs came before this bench with utterly fraudulent claims, supported by deliberate perjury. Kevin and Karen started screaming as the officers moved in. They shouted denials, protests, and empty pleas for their lawyer, who was already halfway out the door. Karen collapsed in hysterics, the performance finally becoming real, genuine agony. But I didn't watch. I turned my back on them just like they had turned their backs on me 30 years earlier. Walking back toward the bench with the quiet certainty of a case finally closed. The debt was settled, not with money, but with legal justice. I had won everything I wanted, not the money, but the final, undeniable judgment. Their lives, built on the currency of my absence, were about to be fully reclaimed. The next step was the fallout, and the work of turning pain into purpose. The presiding judge's gavel signaled not just the dismissal of the lawsuit, but the end of my 30-year sentence of silence. I turned my back on Kevin and Karen, knowing the legal fallout would be absolute and final. The statute of limitations on the 1995 insurance settlement fraud was a complex legal knot. But the perjury they committed in open court that day was fresh and undeniable. They were indicted 3 weeks later. The local news, which had initially run the story of the judge's secret fortune, now ran a very different headline. The parents who sold their child. Their reputation was incinerated. The church cut them off. The neighbors who had brought casseroles for 3 decades demanded explanations they couldn't give. They lost their house to legal fees. They were left with nothing. No money, no status, and no daughters. I didn't keep the $5,500,000. William hadn't given it to me to buy a yacht or a luxury life. He had given it to me to build a safety net, a shield against the cruelty he knew the world held. I used the money to launch the Baggage Claim Foundation. Slept. We provide top-tier legal defense and social services for foster children aging out of the system, ensuring that when the state stops caring, someone else steps in. We make sure no child ever has to stand alone in a terminal wondering if they matter. 6 months later, I sat in a bustling coffee shop in downtown Chicago. Across the table, Megan was laughing at something I said. She looked different now. The weight was gone from her shoulders, the guilt lifted by the truth she had spoken on the stand. She had quit her job at the agency and come to work for the foundation as our lead social worker. We were building a relationship from scratch, brick by brick, without the rod of our parents' lies standing between us. I reached for my coffee, and the sleeve of my coat pulled up, revealing the red wool scarf I was wearing. It was no longer a shield against a biting draft or a symbol of trauma. It was just a scarf, a piece of clothing that looked good with my suit. The coffee shop was noisy, full of clattering cups and cheerful chatter. But for a moment, I let myself listen to the silence underneath it all. It wasn't the terrifying, lonely silence of the airport terminal. It was the peaceful silence of a closed case. It was the silence of a debt finally paid in full, and a legacy secured. I looked at Megan. And I looked at the work we were doing. I wasn't the boy who was left behind. I was the boy who was caught.